Roxy was a 140-pound Caucasian shepherd, bred to face down wolves and bears without flinching, but terrified of thunder. When the massive dog suddenly plunged into a raging tempest, her owners knew something was desperately wrong. Roxy plunges into the downpour, and when she returned, she was not alone. She was carrying something in her mouth, something small, dark, and limp. She stared at her owners with desperate eyes. It wasn't a sock, not a kitten. It was a wild newborn creature, eyes sealed, body ice cold, laid tenderly on her own bed as if it were her pup. The vet doubted it would make it through the night, but what Roxy did next was unbelievable. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The official name for the sound was wind-driven rain, but to Mark Sullivan, it was just plain horizontal. He stood on the deep, covered porch of his North Carolina farmhouse, nursing a mug of coffee he didn't really want, and watched the world dissolve into a gray-green blur. The foothills of the Appalachians were being punished by a late spring deluge, a storm that had boiled up out of the west with unseasonable violence. The wind didn't howl. It shrieked, ripping new leaves from the ancient oaks that guarded his property. "Mark, come away from that door. You're letting the cold in." Mark turned. Eleanor, his wife of 42 years, was bundled in her favorite quilt, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Just watching the creek rise, Elle. It's already halfway up the big willow." "It's a dreadful night," she murmured. A low, guttural whine came from beneath the kitchen table. It was followed by the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of a heavy tail knocking against the table's pedestal. "And of course," Mark said, walking back inside and shutting the solid oak door, "Roxy is convinced the world is ending." Roxy was, by any measure, a magnificent animal. She was a Caucasian shepherd, a 140-pound guardian bred in the mountains of Georgia, the other Georgia, to protect flocks from wolves and bears. Her fur was a thick, multi-layered mantle of wolf gray and pale fawn. Her head was massive, her jaws formidable. She was a living, breathing fortress. But she was terrified of thunder. At the next crash, which rattled the very window panes in their frames, Roxy army crawled from under the table and pressed her enormous body against Eleanor's legs, panting in great, shuddering huffs. "Oh, you great baby," Eleanor cooed, scratching the broad, anxious head. "It's just noise. You're perfectly safe. You're the safest thing in this whole county, and you're scared of a little rain." Roxy whined, her deep brown eyes pleading. She was a paradox, a fearless protector who could face down a stray coyote without blinking, reduced to a quivering mass of fur by barometric pressure. For an hour, the storm raged. Mark and Eleanor read, the power flickering overhead, the only sounds the howl of the wind and Roxy's anxious panting. Then, something changed. Roxy, who had been plastered to Eleanor's side, suddenly lifted her head. Her panting stopped. Her great ears, half hidden in her ruff, swiveled forward. She let out a low woof, a sound of confusion, not alarm. "What is it, girl?" Mark asked, looking up from his magazine. Roxy stood. She walked to the front door, the same door that led to the storm she so despised, and scratched at it. "She needs to go out," Eleanor said, surprised. "In this?" "She hasn't asked to go out in a storm since she was a pup," Mark said, frowning. "She'd rather hold it for 12 hours. Another crash of thunder shook the house. Roxy flinched, backing away from the door, But then a gust of wind brought a sound with it. It was thin, high-pitched, and almost imperceptible. It sounded like a badly oiled hinge, or perhaps a bat. Roxy froze. Her fear was palpable, a tremor running through her shoulders. But another instinct, something older and deeper, was rising to meet it. She whined again, a sound of profound distress, and scratched the door, this time with frantic energy. "Mark, she's serious." All right, girl," Mark grumbled, getting up. "You've picked a heck of a time. Make it quick." He opened the heavy door. The wind ripped it from his grasp, slamming it back against the wall. Rain and leaves blasted into the foyer. Roxy, who would normally have cowered, did the unthinkable. She lowered her head and plunged out into the downpour, disappearing into the gray wall of water almost instantly. "Roxy!" Mark yelled. "Get back here!" He stared into the tempest, his heart suddenly hammering. "Roxy! That crazy dog!" "Mark, what is it?" Eleanor cried, rushing to his side. "She's just gone!" She ran out toward the wood line. For 5 agonizing minutes, they stood in the open doorway, the wind whipping their clothes. Mark grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from the hook, his mind racing through terrible possibilities. Had a tree branch fallen? Was she hurt? "I'm going after her," he said, pulling on his boots. "Mark, don't. You'll be soaked in an instant." "I can't just—" A shape emerged from the gloom. It was Roxy. She was bedraggled, her magnificent coat plastered to her body, looking more like a drowned wolf than a dog. She was walking slowly, deliberately, her head held low. "Oh, thank God," Eleanor breathed. "Get in here, you silly girl, you're—" She stopped. Mark's flashlight beam found the dog, and his stomach dropped. "Roxy," he said, his voice a low command. "What is in your mouth?" "Drop it." Roxy was carrying something, a scrap of something. It was small, limp, and dark. Mark's first horrifying thought was that she'd caught one of the neighbor's new kittens. His second, worse thought was that she'd found a rabbit kit and, in her storm-induced panic, crushed it. "Roxy, I said, drop it!" Mark's voice was stern. He reached for her muzzle. Roxy flinched away from him. It was the first time she had ever disobeyed a direct command. She let out a deep, mournful, protesting whine. Her eyes, fixed on Mark, were not guilty or predatory. They were desperate. She sidestepped her owner, walked past the stunned couple, and dripped a trail of muddy water across Eleanor's clean hardwood floor. She went straight to her crate, a massive custom-built enclosure that was her den, her safe place. With a gentleness that seemed impossible for her sheer size, she lowered her head and deposited the sodden creature onto her own bedding. Then she turned, blocked the entrance with her body, and looked at them. Mark and Eleanor crept closer, flashlight in hand. There, on the plush sheepskin mat, lay the source of the high-pitched cry. It was not a rabbit. It was not a house cat. It was impossibly small, no bigger than a stick of butter. Its fur was matted and dark with rain, but they could just make out a pattern of faint spots. Its eyes and ears were sealed shut. The tiny creature was trembling so violently it seemed to be vibrating. It let out another of those reedy, desperate mews. "My word!" Eleanor whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mark, what is it?" I think it's a bobcat," Mark said, his mind struggling to process the scene. His 140-pound guardian dog, terrified of rain, had run into a thunderstorm to rescue a newborn bobcat kitten. "It's freezing," Eleanor said, snapping into action. "It's dying, Mark. We have to do something." The next few minutes were a blur of organized panic. Eleanor ran for the softest guest towels. Mark found a shoebox. Roxy refused to move, whining in distress as Eleanor gently scooped up the frigid kitten. "It's like a little piece of ice," Eleanor murmured, her voice tight with worry. She began to pat it dry, her large hands impossibly gentle. The kitten was so weak it could barely move, its tiny needle-clawed paws curled into tight fists. "What do we do?" Mark asked, feeling useless. "We can't. I mean, it's a wild animal." "It's a baby," Eleanor said fiercely, as if that settled it. "It's a baby, and it's dying. Get a hot water bottle. No, better, the heating pad from my closet, and call Dr. Eris. Wake him up. I don't care what time it is." Dr. Eris was the county's large animal vet, a pragmatic man who had seen just about everything their rural life had to offer. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice gravelly with sleep. Mark explained the situation, feeling more foolish with every word. "And Roxy, our dog. She just brought it inside. It's a bobcat, Eris. Tiny. Eyes shut." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Well, Mark," Eris finally said, "that's a new one. A Caucasian shepherd playing midwife to a lynx rufus." He sighed. "Eyes sealed, you said? It's less than a week old. The mother likely had a den somewhere nearby. This storm, it must have flooded her out. She was probably moving the litter and dropped this one. She won't be back for it. Not in this." "It's so cold, Eris," Mark said, watching Eleanor wrap the kitten in a towel and place it in the shoebox on top of the heating pad, set to low. "It's hypothermic," Eris said grimly. "That's what'll kill it long before starvation. Honestly, son, its chances are next to nil. You're doing the right thing with the heating pad. Don't make it too hot. You can try. If you have any KMR, kitten formula?" "No, nothing like that," Mark said. "All right. You could try a few drops of lukewarm sugar water just to get some calories in it, but don't force it. It probably can't even swallow. The main thing is warmth. Keep it warm and, well, hope for the best. I'll stop by in the morning if it makes it through the night." The "if" hung in the air long after Mark hung up the phone. Eleanor tried, using a small, sterile syringe, to get a single drop of sugar water into the kitten's mouth. The tiny, triangular head barely moved. It wouldn't, or couldn't, open its mouth. Its breathing was shallow, punctuated by those violent shudders. Roxy, displaced from her crate, was a wreck. She paced the kitchen, her claws click-clacking on the floor. She'd whine, then run to the shoebox, nudging it with her great nose, huffing warm, moist air onto the kitten. "No, girl, you'll bother it," Eleanor gently scolded, pushing the massive head away. They sat vigil for hours. Mark and Eleanor in their armchairs, the storm still lashing the house, the shoebox on the coffee table between them. By 2 a.m., the kitten's shivers had stopped. "Oh, Mark," Eleanor whispered, her heart sinking. "It stopped shaking. Is that good?" Mark reached in and touched the tiny flank. The kitten was still cold, but it felt limp. Its breathing was now barely a flicker. It let out one last faint squeak, a sound so thin it was barely there. And then it fell still. "Oh no," Eleanor's voice broke. "Oh, poor, poor little thing." Roxy, who had been watching with agonizing intensity, seemed to understand the shift. She stood up. She whimpered, a deep, primal sound of loss that shook Mark to his core. "It's gone, girl," Mark said, his own throat thick. "You tried. You were a good girl." But Roxy was not giving up. She walked to the coffee table. Before Mark or Eleanor could react, she nudged the shoebox with her nose, hard. Then she did something truly unbelievable. She reached her enormous head into the box, and with the same impossible gentleness she'd shown at the door, she gripped the kitten in her massive, wolf-like jaws. "Roxy! No!" Mark shouted, lurching forward. But she was too fast. She turned, carried the limp body back to her own crate, and stepped inside. She lay down, curling her 140-pound frame into a protective crescent. She placed the kitten against her bare belly, a patch of thinner fur high up on her flank, right against the steady, thudding drum of her own heart. Mark and Eleanor just stared, frozen in disbelief. Roxy lowered her head, resting her chin on her paws, and began to purr. It wasn't a purr, not like a cat's. It was a deep, thoracic rumble, a huffing, rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from her very soul. She nuzzled the kitten, breathing hot air over it, and then she was still, a mountain of fur guarding a dying ember. What do we do?" Eleanor whispered. I think we do nothing," Mark said, his voice awed. "I think we let her." They fell asleep in their chairs, exhausted by the emotional toll. The storm finally rumbled its way east, leaving a profound, dripping silence in its wake. Mark woke first, his neck stiff, to the pale gray light of dawn. The first thing he registered was the silence. The second was a sound. A tiny, angry squeak. He shot out of his chair. Eleanor startled awake. "What? Is it?" Mark was already at the crate, peering into the furry darkness. Roxy lifted her head, gave Mark a sleepy, tail-thumping woof, and looked down. There, nestled against her warm belly, the Bobcat kitten was wiggling. It was alive. Its fur was dry and fluffy. Its tiny paws, no longer clenched, were twitching and kneading the air. As they watched, it let out another surprisingly robust mew. Eleanor burst into tears. "Mark, it's warm, it's warm." She reached in. Roxy, the ultimate guardian, allowed it. Eleanor scooped up the kitten. It was no longer an ice cube. It was a vibrant, living creature, its body thrumming with warmth. When Dr. Aris arrived 2 hours later, coffee and a box of KMR in hand, he was speechless. He listened to the story, his stethoscope pressed to the kitten's tiny, buzzing chest. I'll be," he said, shaking his head. "I've been a vet for 30 years. I've seen some things. But this." He looked at Roxy, who was watching his every move with quiet intensity. The heating pad wasn't enough. It was too passive. It couldn't bring the core temp up from that low. But her body heat, her heartbeat, that rumble. He looked at Mark and Eleanor. That dog didn't just comfort it. She saved its life. That steady, living warmth. She reversed the hypothermia. I've simply never seen anything like it. From that moment on, the house had a new, unspoken dynamic. Roxy was the mother. The kitten, which Eleanor promptly named Smokey, was her baby. Roxy took her duties with a seriousness that was both comical and deeply touching. The shoebox was abandoned. Smokey lived in the crate with Roxy. When Eleanor brought the syringe of warm KMR every 2 hours, Roxy would sit by, watching. After every feeding, Roxy would take over, her large, rough tongue meticulously washing Smokey, nudging and cleaning him from head to tail. Dr. Aris explained that this stimulation was vital for the kitten's digestion and bodily functions, a job its own mother would have done. Roxy had known. When Smokey's eyes finally opened, a week later, the first thing he saw was the enormous, furry, benevolent face of his canine mother. The weeks turned into a month. Smokey grew, his legs getting long and gangly, his ears sprouting tiny tufts of black fur. His spots became more pronounced. He was, unequivocally, a bobcat. And he was, unequivocally, Roxy's son. He learned to play. His first wobbly pounces were directed at the massive, twitching tip of Roxy's tail. She would pretend not to notice, until her tail would suddenly pounce back, swatting him gently. He would disappear into the thick ruff of her neck, only to re-emerge on the other side, launching a ferocious attack on her nose. Roxy, whose jaws could snap a coyote's leg, would mouth the kitten, engulfing his entire head in her mouth, only to release him, unharmed and slobbery, ready for more. She taught him to stalk, using her big rope toy as a target. She would lie perfectly still, and he would mimic her, his tiny body low to the ground, his haunches wiggling, before he launched his brave 2-foot pounce. They were the heart of the household. Mark would sit on the porch, and Roxy would lie at his feet, with Smokey curled up asleep on top of her. When the mailman came, Roxy would let out her deep woof, and from behind her massive leg, Smokey would offer a tiny, brave shh. But as spring turned to summer, a shadow began to grow. Smokey was not a kitten anymore. He was a lanky, powerful adolescent. His pounces had real weight. His claws, which he kept sheathed with Roxy, were sharp. He had, one evening, caught a moth out of the air with breathtaking speed. The conversations with Dr. Aris became more frequent and more somber. "He's a success story, Eleanor," Aris said, scratching Smokey behind the ears, a privilege only he, Mark, and Eleanor were afforded. "He's healthy, strong, and thanks to Roxy, he's surprisingly well-adjusted. She taught him how to be a predator in her own way. She taught him to play hunt, to be brave. He's so happy here," Eleanor said, her voice quiet. "He is," Aris agreed, "but he's not a dog. And he's not a pet. It's not fair to him. And frankly, it's not legal. He needs to be what he is." Mark nodded, the words landing like stones. "What do we do, Aries?" "I've been in touch with a rehabilitation center. A good one. They have a soft release program for bobcats. They have large, multi-acre enclosures. He'll be with other young bobcats. He'll learn to hunt live prey, to be wary of humans. He'll learn to be a bobcat. And then they'll set him free, deep in the national forest." This was the real unthinkable thing. It was one thing to rescue a dying creature. It was another to raise it, to love it, and then to give it up. The day came on a bright, clear morning in late July. The rehab center's van, marked with Appalachian Wildlife Rescue, pulled up the long gravel driveway. Eleanor was crying silently, packing a small blanket that smelled like Roxy into the carrier. Mark was stone-faced, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. The hardest part was Roxy. She knew. As soon as the carrier came out, she knew. She began to pace, whining, that same sound of profound distress she'd made the night of the storm. When the woman from the center, a kind-faced biologist named Hannah, walked in, Roxy immediately put herself between the woman and Smokey. She didn't growl. She just stood. A mountain. "It's okay, girl," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. He put his hand on Roxy's collar. "It's okay. You did good. You did. You did so good." He had to hold Roxy's collar while Eleanor and Hannah gently guided Smokey into the carrier. The Bobcat, sensing the tension, hissed for the first time at his human family. "That's good," Hannah said softly. "That's the wildness we want." And then he was gone. The van disappeared down the driveway. Mark let go of Roxy. The great dog ran to the front door, scratching, whining for the baby that had been taken. She paced the house for hours, checking her crate, checking the porch, checking under the table. That night, she lay in her empty crate, her head on her paws, and let out a single mournful sigh that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the house. Eleanor and Mark sat on the porch, not speaking, watching the fireflies ignite in the twilight. The house felt empty. 6 months passed. The blazing colors of fall gave way to the sharp, clean bite of winter. Roxy was still Roxy. She was still their guardian, still a comfort. But there was a quietness to her, a part of her that seemed to be listening, waiting. Just before Christmas, a thick envelope arrived. It was from the Wildlife Center. Inside, there was no letter, just a single photograph. It was a grainy, black and white image from a trail camera. It showed a patch of snowy woods, deep and remote. Standing on a fallen log, looking back at the camera, was a bobcat. It was no longer a lanky adolescent. It was magnificent. Sleek, powerful, its spotted coat thick against the cold. Its ears were tufted, its gaze clear and wild. At the bottom, a handwritten note. Smokey, 10 Mile Creek Release Site. Thriving. Thank you. Eleanor pinned the photo to the corkboard in the kitchen, right next to a faded picture of Roxy as a puppy. Life went on. The bond between the old couple and their aging dog, forged in shared loss, was deeper than ever. One evening, late the following spring, Mark and Eleanor were on the porch, just as they had been the night of the storm. Roxy was lying at their feet, her great gray muzzle resting on Mark's boot, dozing in the twilight. From the deep shadows of the woodline, a sound came. It was not a bird. It was not a coyote. It was a short, sharp, coughing bark. Roxy's head snapped up, her ears shot forward. She stood, every line of her body alert, and stared into the woods. She didn't bark, she didn't growl. She just vibrated, a low rumble in her chest. Eleanor grabbed Mark's arm. "What?" And then they saw it. Just for a second. A flicker of movement. A shadow, low and spotted, moving with fluid feline grace through the undergrowth at the very edge of their property. It paused, a pair of eyes reflecting the porch light, and then it was gone. Was it him? Was it just another of the woods' many secrets? They would never know. Roxy took a step forward to the edge of the porch. She let out a low, soft woof. It was not a challenge. It was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement. She stood there for a long minute, just listening. Then she turned, walked back to Mark, and laid her head on his knee, letting out a deep, contented sigh. Eleanor put her hand on her husband's. She saved him, Mark. She really did. Mark looked out at the dark, quiet woods, then down at the magnificent dog who had defied her own fear to answer a cry in the rain. He put his hand on Roxy's head, feeling the steady, loyal warmth of her. "No, Elle," he said softly. "I think in the end they saved each other."